Not all wounds bleed. Some cuts lie silently within the bonds of blood invisible to the eye, yet they sink deep into the marrow. Family. What should be the safest place is sometimes the perfect stage for betrayal, dressed in gentleness, where kinship is measured by columns in an asset ledger. This is the story of Serena Whitlow, a quiet, resilient woman who lived her whole life in devotion to the word family, only to one day realize she had merely been a pawn in the ruthless plans of those who shared her blood. But instead of bowing her head, she chose to rise. No shouting, no tears, no revenge driven by hate, but with clarity evidence, and a plan that forced everyone to see her in an entirely new light. That Christmas in the house Serena once called a home, the lights didn't just illuminate the room, they exposed the secret she had been forced to ignore for 34 years. This is not only a journey of unraveling a conspiracy, but a declaration sometimes the one deemed most vulnerable is the very person holding the power to decide how it all ends. Sap still clung to Serena's hands as she stretched to hang the final string of Christmas lights along the edge of the front porch. The warm, golden glow reflected through the window painting what seemed to be a peaceful holiday scene, but behind the sheer white curtain that peace was on the verge of shattering. In that moment, amid the rustling wind and the scent of cinnamon cookies drifting from the kitchen, a familiar voice rang out. Not a festive greeting or a warm family anecdote, but cruel words spoken by her own mother, Deborah. It's shameful to call her my daughter. Once the renovations are done, cut her off. Serena has no value to this family anymore. Lydia, her younger sister, chimed in with contempt. You should have let her pay for everything and then kicked her out. Who lets a construction worker live in a house like this? Just looking at her is embarrassing. Serena stood frozen, both hands gripping the window ledge, each breath crystallizing in the December chill. She didn't need to look to know the calculating glances they exchanged, the same glances that had always made her uneasy without knowing why. But now she understood. For 34 years, Serena had lived in this house like a shadow, the responsible one, the provider, the one who stepped back, so others could step forward. She had paid every renovation bill, laid each floor tile by hand, rebuilt the fence, and constructed the back patio where her mother often hosted tea parties. She had no family of her own, no wedding photos or children to make others proud, and for that she had always been labeled the failure. Yet she had once believed if she just worked hard enough, gave enough, one day they would see her. They would understand how deeply she loved this family. But the twinkling lights Serena hung to brighten this night couldn't illuminate the darkness hidden behind the performative smiles at the holiday table. For the first time, she looked at the house not as a place she belonged to, but as a stage one, where she had been cast as background to someone else's spotlight. And that role she would no longer play. Without a word, Serena stepped back from the window, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked back inside. The smell of baked goods, the holiday music, and the laughter still floated through the air, as if the world hadn't changed. But within her, something had slammed shut, not a broken heart, but a door opening. She smiled a breath-light smile, then bent down to adjust the last strand of lights. The glow had to be perfect, because this would be the last Christmas they believed she didn't know. The next morning, Serena woke earlier than usual, a reflex ingrained deep in her bones. She brewed coffee using the exact beans her mother liked, pure Arabica, and placed the ceramic pot on a wooden tray alongside two white porcelain cups rimmed in gold. On the dining table, she laid out a hand-embroidered cloth and arranged the dried cedar bouquet she had crafted the night before. Everything was perfect, just like every other year. Because for 34 years, Serena had never let anything fall short when it came to serving her family. From the meticulously prepared holiday meals to the smallest details of the house, she had always been the one behind it all, making everything feel like a real family. But inside, it no longer felt like love. It had become an invisible contract, signed by her alone while everyone else reaped the rewards without paying the price. She thought back to past holidays when Lydia brought a new boyfriend each year, greeted by their parents with laughter and glasses of glistening wine. Serena, even if she had just finished stacking a mountain of gifts or laying stone in the backyard, received only remarks like, "Go change, you look dirty," or "Don't forget to buy more white wine for Grandpa." They were used to her being ready. They were used to her presence as if it were automatic. No one asked if she was tired, if she was happy, if she felt fulfilled. Because to them, Serena was always the one who had nothing better to do, had no husband or kids, didn't need anyone to worry about her. She used to believe that if she kept enduring, kept giving, they would one day see her. She had turned down opportunities to expand her business because Mom needs me home this summer, to fix the roof, postponed vacations because Lydia's pregnant, and there's no one to help Mom plan the baby shower. She once believed that family meant responsibility, but now, knowing it had all been exploitation family trips she funded taken for granted, the kitchen renovations she did by hand, dismissed as a single woman's odd hobby, she felt like a stranger in her own life. Every tile she laid, every curtain she replaced, every dollar she saved to improve the house, wasn't because she didn't know how to spend, but because she believed this was her home. She hadn't been building a house, she had been building loyalty. But when loyalty turns into obligation and her presence becomes a burden, the only thing left is clarity. Serena washed dishes in silence, her calloused hands scraping against the smooth ceramic the way truth had begun to strip away the glossy finish of the relationships around her. Yesterday had shown her what she had lost. Today she began to think about what she could reclaim. That night, after everyone had gone upstairs, Serena sat alone in the kitchen, the dim light from the fixture above the stone counter casting a soft glow on the laptop before her, familiar, yet quietly menacing. She had never imagined she would one day use it to monitor her own family, but the artificial silence from the people she once loved had given her a valid reason. Lately, her mother had been hiding her phone whenever Serena entered the room, whispering hurriedly to someone during short calls, her eyes avoiding Serena's, as though she were carrying a secret too heavy to balance. Serena had once dismissed it as a private quirk of aging, but now she wasn't so sure. She opened the laptop and typed in passwords her mother had once used for simple things: Lydia's birthday, the name of their old family dog, her parents' wedding year. On the third try, she was in. The email folder opened not to newsletters or bills, but to living proof. Emails with dry titles like Asset Transfer Plan and Create New File. Ensure Serena doesn't find out appeared regularly. The sender was Miles, Lydia's husband, the one who always wore a mask of politeness at dinner, but never hid the judgment in his eyes whenever she spoke about construction work. They were discussing in detail the timeline for completing the renovations, the investment amounts, and even legal strategies to ensure Serena couldn't contest anything. She read line by line, her stomach twisting. They were waiting for her to finish the hardest parts, and then quietly toss her aside like leftover building material. But the worst wasn't even that. A separate string of messages signed simply V drew Serena's attention. The more she read, the more unsettled she became. V wasn't a lawyer nor a relative, but Victor Rayner, a name she recognized immediately, once her father's best friend, a familiar face at childhood family gatherings until one day he vanished without explanation. The messages between her mother and Victor spanned years, filled with emotional undertones and vague financial transactions. Her mother hadn't just betrayed Serena's trust, she had been using Serena's own savings to sustain a hidden relationship. Small transfers spread out just enough to avoid suspicion, but collectively amounting to tens of thousands of dollars, all withdrawn from the fund Serena had contributed to for family vacations. Vacations, it turned out, that were nothing more than a cover. Serena didn't cry. She didn't scream or smash a glass like in the movies. She just sat there, her eyes locked on the glowing blue screen, as if it were a doorway to another reality, one where she was no longer the dutiful daughter, but someone who had been deceived by her own blood. And in that moment she knew this wasn't about emotions anymore. This was strategy. And she, a builder, knew better than anyone that if a house is rotting from the inside, you have to take it apart brick by brick down to the foundation. The next morning, Serena drove out of Maple Hollow before the sun had even risen over the ridge of pine trees. The streets were blanketed in mist, and the pale yellow glow of the streetlights cast soft reflections onto her old pickup truck. The same truck that once carried brick cement and tender hopes of being recognized. But today, it carried someone else, a Serena who had stayed silent long enough. She arrived at the law office she had once worked with when founding her company, bringing with her a thick folder, a USB drive containing all the emails, financial statements, and a notebook filled with meticulous notes. The lawyer's face turned serious as he skimmed the first pieces of evidence. "You want to sue them?" he asked, hesitant. Serena shook her head. "I want to protect what I've spent my whole life building." That afternoon, when the family wasn't home, she returned. Her footsteps were light as wind, but every action calculated with precision. She installed discreet recording devices in the living room, the kitchen, and even in her mother's bedroom, where the woman often made late-night phone calls thinking no one could hear. A tiny camera was hidden in a fake plant, a storage device tucked cleverly behind the electrical panel. Serena disliked invading anyone's privacy, especially that of family, but all boundaries had already been broken when they turned her into a tool for manipulating assets. She needed the truth, and this time she would get it at any cost. By day, she continued playing the role of the dutiful daughter pulling milk from the fridge, listening as Lydia talked about upcoming birthday plans, smiling as Miles rambled about smart investment strategies, but every nod, "that sounds great," was another link in the chain Serena was quietly tightening. At night, when the house fell silent, she sat alone in the small woodworking shed behind the yard. There, among the scent of fresh timber and the soft glow of amber light, she began listing every single expense, from the custom mahogany window frames, the Italian crystal chandelier in the dining room, to the stone-clad front steps, each with invoices, blueprints, and photos documenting the process. She created a spreadsheet categorizing by labor, materials, and construction time. The final number blinked on the screen. 57,450 tiers. The amount she had invested in the house they now planned to strip from her. Serena looked at that number not with regret, but with clarity. She had never asked anyone to repay her because she believed she was doing it for family. But now things were different. She was no longer the quiet, self-sacrificing daughter. She was a woman awakened, betrayed, and fully aware that if she didn't protect her own work, no one else would. The wall of family she once believed in had cracked and collapsed, but this time the one holding the blueprint to rebuild wasn't anyone else. It was her. That Thursday, just as Serena arrived home after a day supervising a construction site, the recording device in her handbag signaled it had captured a new conversation. Her hands still dusted with paint, she sat on the wooden porch chair, put on her headphones, and within the first few seconds it felt as though the world around her stopped breathing. Lydia's voice came through falsely sweet, as if she were discussing a defective product rather than her own sister. "Miles has finished the paperwork. It's all legal now. The house can be transferred any time. And Mom agreed too. Didn't she?" Deborah responded, her voice heavy but without hesitation. "Yes. I can't live in this tension anymore. Serena isn't the kind of person we need in this family. A single woman in construction, no degree. She makes everything you've built seem cheap." Lydia laughed. "You even told Victor you couldn't stand one more Christmas dinner with her." Serena closed her eyes and quietly removed the headphones. In her mind, the recording still echoed like church bells waking the spiritually asleep. Every sentence, every word, irrefutable proof that they weren't just cutting her out of the property, but out of their hearts. But what stunned her even more was Victor's presence in the conversation. He was no longer an outsider. He was part of the plan. A man working behind the scenes, patiently waiting for Deborah to clear everything out so they could start a new life together. Her mother hadn't just betrayed her daughter, she had betrayed her husband, and the memories etched into that home. Serena pictured Deborah whispering to Victor on the phone, possibly from the very room where her father once slept, where their wedding photo still hung. That voice, once a lullaby from her childhood, had now become the trigger for war. That night, Serena skipped dinner. She went upstairs, turned on her laptop, and began backing up every recording, organizing them into labeled segments: the meeting, to decide my fate, the legal eviction plan evidence tied to Victor Rayner. Each file was encrypted and saved onto an external hard drive stored in the company's safe. She was no longer acting out of emotion, she had entered strategic mode. The evidence wasn't just for protection, it was for timing, for choosing the perfect moment to strike. The next morning, Deborah asked Serena to help plan Lydia's birthday party. She nodded without a flicker of emotion. "Of course, Mom, I'll handle it." That evening in the workshop, amidst the sound of sawing and the scent of fresh wood, Serena opened the layout for the party seating chart. But instead of figuring out how to please Lydia, she was calculating the ideal positions for a projector, speakers, and the presentation of evidence. It would no longer be a birthday party, it would be a trial. And this time the truth would not be buried beneath clinking wine glasses and hollow toasts. That morning began like any other celebration in the Whitlow family, featuring the finest tablecloth silverware polished to a gleam, and the porcelain plates rimmed with gold that only made appearances on important occasions. But no one in that house knew that today they would be the honored guests at a public unveiling of their own misdeeds, staged on the most familiar stage of all, the family dining room. Serena stood in the kitchen, adjusting the collar of her charcoal gray blazer, the outfit she usually wore when presenting to investors. Not because she needed to look good today, but because she wanted to project clarity, decisiveness, a version of herself they had never seen before. Next to her plate sat a tablet already connected to the large screen mounted on the wall, and beneath it a thick folder tied neatly with a red silk ribbon. Each item in that folder was a crack, and today all of them would break wide open. Deborah entered with tense eyes, repeatedly glancing at her phone as if awaiting an important message from somewhere else. Lydia and Miles arrived later, right on time, carrying a carefully wrapped birthday gift. Harrison, the only one seemingly unaware of anything, poured wine and joked that this year's vintage was suspiciously better than usual. Serena smiled and sat down, letting them savor every dish within the false comfort of fabricated trust. Then, when no one expected it, she stood, raised her glass, her voice low but steady. "Before we celebrate Lydia's birthday, I think we should toast to something else: honesty, and to finally looking at the true foundation of this family." Heads turned, some glances puzzled. Serena set her glass down and activated the screen. It switched to a recording. "She's such an embarrassment. Who lets a woman in construction live in a house like this?" Lydia's voice. Then Deborah's, clear and cold. "Wait until she finishes the renovations, then transfer the property. She's not part of this anymore." A click, and Serena paused the audio. She didn't need to say a word. The air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Miles sat frozen. The color drained from Lydia's face. Deborah remained silent, but her knuckles whitened as they tightened around her wine glass. Serena walked slowly around the table, each step light but resolute. She opened the folder and pulled out document after document, a detailed ledger of the $50,450 she personally invested into the house statements, showing secret financial transfers from the family fund into Deborah's private account, and handwritten messages exchanged with Victor. "Once Serena's out of the way, we'll start fresh." Harrison had stopped pouring wine. He sat still, eyes locked on the email titled "New Life Plan." "And that," Serena said, her voice calm and deliberate, "is what I received after 34 years of calling this place home." Silence. No applause. No congratulations. Lydia's birthday party, once expected to be a moment of personal glory, had become a stark tribunal where every player was caught in the brightest spotlight of all, the light of truth. Harrison was the first to shatter the frozen silence with the heavy, abrupt scrape of a chair. It toppled backward as if shoved by a fury too long restrained. The wine glass slipped from his hand and spilled onto the floor, soaking into the rug Serena had brought back from a business trip to Portland, a gift no one had paid the slightest attention to at the time. He didn't look at Serena nor at Deborah. He just stood there for a few seconds frozen, as if trying to comprehend the words on the screen once more. Once Serena's out of the way, we'll start fresh. V. Neat, brief letters, but with enough explosive force to obliterate a 34-year marriage in under a minute. Deborah reached out, grasping Serena's wrist, her voice trembling. You misunderstood, Serena. Those words? They're not what you think. Serena didn't pull away. She didn't speak. She simply looked into her mother's eyes, not tearful, not fragile, but unwavering, with a steadiness that made the woman across from her visibly unsettled. You wrote them. You counted the days. You tracked every dollar. And you called me a burden. All those times I thought you were just tired, just preoccupied. It was all lies. Miles, seated beside Lydia, quietly bent over his phone, his fingers scrolling in haste. Serena caught the motion and let out a soft laugh, a sound delicate as the snip of scissors but sharp enough to cut. Deleting files. Are you? I suggest you stop. Everything's been backed up and submitted to my lawyer, including the recording where you advised Deborah on how to legally strip me of ownership of my own house. Deborah flailed, turning toward her husband. Harrison, please let me explain. You know how long it's been since we were close. You left me alone for too long. But Harrison's voice was steel, each word hitting the table already soaked in betrayal. And that gave you reason to betray me with Victor. My best friend, the man who toasted with me in this very kitchen. And you used our daughter's money to support him. His hands trembled not from weakness but from the weight of humiliation buried for far too long. Lydia began to cry, hiding her face in a napkin, but Serena didn't look her way. Her gaze remained fixed on her mother, not in search of love or explanation, but in release. You once said I didn't know how to sacrifice for family. Now I understand in this house, sacrifice means letting others trample your trust and calling it duty. No one said another word. There was nothing left to defend. The silence wasn't the awkward kind that haunted joyless family dinners. It was the first honest moment between people who had long believed they could hide everything under the label of family. And at the very center of it stood Serena, the one they had once thought the easiest to control, now steering the wheel of her own fate. As the living room door closed behind Lydia and Miles, Serena stood in the empty hallway, the ceiling light casting her shadow long across the cold, mirror-like stone floor. Only she and Deborah remained two women who had once shared a home, now facing each other like strangers speaking different languages. Her mother no longer held her composed exterior. Her makeup had smudged around her eyes. Her hands trembled as she struggled to undo a loose button, as if being choked by the very dress she wore to make an impression at the family gathering. She looked at Serena, her eyes now pleading more than challenging. Serena, can we talk privately? This isn't how things were supposed to end. Serena didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at her mother as though waiting for something, a final scrap of honesty, a confession worthy of the pain. But when it didn't come, she sighed, walked to the coat closet near the door, and retrieved her small handbag and thick folder. There's nothing left to say, Mom. Everything you needed to hear I've said with evidence. Everything I needed to know you've said with actions. Her voice wasn't sharp nor angry, it was calm, so calm it caught Deborah off guard. You spent a lifetime preparing to cut me out of this family, Serena said, hand resting on the doorknob, but you never prepared for the moment I actually walked away. I'll be back tomorrow to collect my tools and company documents. As for the rest, you can keep it. I don't need it anymore. Deborah staggered forward a step, then stopped short as if hitting an invisible wall. You'll regret this. You'll feel alone, Serena. Family isn't something you can just walk away from. But Serena simply nodded, as if accepting even the things she was about to lose. You're wrong. Loneliness is sitting at a dinner table with people laughing over your pain. Loneliness is having your contributions treated as obligations. And walking away. Sometimes that's the only way to find yourself again. She opened the door. There was no loud slam, no tears. Just the quiet of someone stepping out of the past like shedding a skin grown too tight. That night, Serena stayed at a small lakeside hotel 3 miles outside Maple Hollow. She turned on the room light, hung her coat on a hook, and placed the hard drive containing all her files on the desk like a symbol of a new journey. For the first time in weeks, she lay down without the fear that someone might alter her fate while she slept. Outside, the wind knocked against the window cold but clean. She stared at the ceiling, no longer thinking about what had been taken from her, but about what she was about to rebuild from the wreckage left by the very people who once called themselves her family. 3 months later, Serena lived in a high-floor apartment overlooking Lake Orland, its surface reflecting the morning light like a quiet blessing each time she drew back the curtains. The space was small but spacious enough to breathe, to work, and most importantly to exist unencumbered by the memories of lies. One corner of the living room had been transformed into a miniature studio with drafting tables, measuring tools, blueprints, and a wooden box filled with material samples. In the evenings, instead of cooking for others, she cooked for herself. Instead of asking whether she had pleased anyone that day, she asked herself, "Do I feel at peace?" And most of the time, the answer was yes. Her construction company, Hollow Beam Construction, had secured 2 new projects. One was a lakeside restaurant, the other a cabin resort upstate. The clients didn't know the story behind her calloused hands and once weary eyes. They only knew she was punctual, meticulous, and had a way of turning drawings into something real, something lasting. Harrison, her father, had kept his promise to revise the will, but what Serena cherished more was their lunch meetings on the last Friday of every month at a small diner near the university where he now taught part-time. They shared sandwiches and iced tea, talking about things that had nothing to do with her mother Lydia or Victor. They talked about new materials in construction, about how oak wood responded differently to temperature, about which paint held up best against lakefront winds. They didn't call it reconciliation. They simply started again, like 2 people walking forward without owing each other silence anymore. One quiet weekend afternoon, Serena stood in her living room measuring a section of wall where she planned to hang a sculpture made of recycled iron, the first item she had ever bought for herself without trying to please anyone. The afternoon light stretched across the wooden floor, softly honoring the space, as if it had been waiting for her all along. If someone had walked in and asked, "What are you measuring?" she might have smiled and replied, "I'm measuring space for a new life." But deep down, she knew she was measuring more than that. She was measuring the distance between what had been taken and what had finally been reclaimed. Measuring the boundary between the past and her rebirth. And this time, there was no one standing behind her waiting to take what she built. She held the blueprints. She was the architect of herself. Messages from Lydia were still forwarded to her attorney. Apologies, too late, proposals to start over, empty promises. Serena no longer read them. She didn't need to, because sometimes forgiveness doesn't come from forgetting, it comes from stepping out of the ruins, looking back, and gently smiling, "I survived. And now it's time to truly live." Not everyone born under the same roof walks the same path. Some choose silence to keep the peace, some choose forgiveness to stop the pain, but some, like Serena, choose the truth, even at the cost of losing a family. She didn't tear it all down for revenge. She dismantled every brick of worn-out trust to rebuild something stronger for herself. And perhaps the greatest lesson is, this love cannot be an obligation, and blood cannot be a free pass to betrayal. If you've ever felt overlooked in your own family, if you're quietly enduring wounds dismissed as just family stuff, know this: you are not alone. Share this video to spread a message of awakening and self-ownership. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reach deeply and resonate fully. Because sometimes it's through the cracks that the light finally gets in.